I'm Irene Dunn with the Chester Public Library, and we're located in the Hudson Valley in New York. We're collaborating with Dana Ripper from the Missouri River Bird Observatory and the Beyond Plastics organization. We are happy to be able to present this program about the ocean and plastics in the ocean. We are participating in the collaborative summer reading program. The theme is Oceans of Possibilities. I'd like to introduce Dana. Dana Ripper is the executive director of the Missouri River Bird Observatory. In 2010, Dana co-founded the Missouri River Bird Observatory, a nonprofit organization dedicated to conservation via science, education, and advocacy. Since plastic production and waste mismanagement pose significant threats to the conservation of wildlife, climate stability, and natural resources, one of Dana's major emphasis is her work with the Missouri River Bird Observatory is systemic reduction in single-use plastics. She is pleased to have become part of the Beyond Plastics Volunteer Speaker Bureau. Welcome, Dana. Thank you very much for being here.
Thanks so much, Irene. Folks, if you want to, while I'm getting some slides shared here, feel free to put your location in the chat. So I think that we've got folks from various places, given that this is a nice virtual format here. So let's see. There we go. Thanks for that introduction, Irene. And I'm just really pleased that you reached out to Beyond Plastics and that I was able to connect with you for doing this presentation on the ocean. I certainly learned a lot putting it together, specifically about the issues affecting our waterways, seas, and oceans. And so we're going to discuss some of that right now. So here is relatively where we are at. I'm here in central Missouri. And then here is the library in Chester, New York. And so folks that are tuning in from the East Coast might be wondering why some person from about as far away from a coast as one could get would be talking about plastics. And we're going to see one of the reasons why it's, certainly an issue that affects the entire country and really every landmass and ultimately ends up with our ocean plastics problem. So as a wildlife biologist, specifically an ornithologist, what actually got me into the plastics issue in the first place is learning about the ocean marine debris that is affecting wildlife all over the world. And, seeing more and more images like this one come to light in the media. These are albatrosses on a very remote Pacific island. And we have been seeing more things like this. And I thought to myself, how could this possibly be happening? Surely we can, cease the illegal dumping that must be occurring if we're, have results like this, or we can clean up our oceans. And it turns out that it's not that simple, of course. So this problem of ocean plastics is credited largely as having been observed in Lasian albatrosses starting in 1966. So ornithologists that were working with albatrosses in these remote areas started seeing more and more plastic within their study species. They started observing things like parents feeding their young in the nest with plastic pieces. And so they actually started raising the alarm at that point in the late 60s. At that point, plastic production was less than 5% of what it is today. And so recently, I know, and I'm sorry about these really unpleasant pictures, but I think it's important that folks, really see what this is doing to our wildlife, both on land, of course, and in the ocean, where a lot of this plastic debris ultimately ends up. And I'm really sorry about this one, but many of you might have seen this before. This has become a famous, iconic video, actually, of researchers that pulled a plastic straw out of a sea turtle's nose. And the only, positive thing that I can possibly say about this image is that it raised a lot of awareness for the problem of plastic in the oceans. I believe that at last count, this YouTube video has had more than 30 million views. So I think that it really did start making folks aware of this issue and wanting to do something about it. So there's a couple different ways in which plastic waste will harm our ocean wildlife. And those main ways are ingestion and then entanglement. And so we'll talk some today about microplastics and how those occur in oceans. And that is one of the main forms of ingestion, certainly with species that are lower on the food chain, if you will. So we have microplastics so small in the ocean now that even plankton are eating them. And then, of course, fish are eating the plankton and so on. And we also have situations where animals are ingesting larger pieces of plastic, including things like plastic bags. We also have entanglement problems. You can imagine and have probably heard of ghost nets, so fishing nets that have been abandoned, maybe they weren't able to be retrieved, and they're sort of floating around the ocean, and animals can get caught in them. And there's also many documented instances of animals being caught in things like plastic bags or the 6-ring soda holders. So major problem, you can see that the extent of this is shown here in the number of species that are affected, and it's in the hundreds. So how is this happening and what are we doing about it? Well, it's not as if no one knows. This is a quote from an article that came out just a couple days ago in The Guardian, and it's about how the plastic industry used the pandemic to just sort of further ramp up production and use it as a reason why we shouldn't be reducing plastic, of course, because in some cases there were much needed health interventions that occurred that were made of plastic material during the pandemic. However, it was used in a pretty unethical way to continue the production and proliferation of single-use plastics. And you can see here that public outrage against this problem of plastic pollution and disposable plastics was really ramping up before the pandemic. And it was said at a meeting in 2019, we need to get the image of plastic in oceans out of the public mind. Otherwise, we could lose our social license to operate. Not we need to stop it from happening, but we need people to not think about it. Otherwise, we're going to get in trouble. So tonight, we'll just be discussing how we got here, what is kind of going on in reality, like what this looks like in the ocean, why it's continuing, and then some solutions and courses of action. And Irene and I were thinking that I'll just go through some slides here, and then we can have questions at the end. Please feel free to put them in the chat if you want, or at the end, everybody can come off mute. This is a small enough meeting that we can discuss. So in addition to the end of life pollution that we can all, sort of visually see and document, and I put end of life in quotes because plastic being what it is doesn't actually biodegrade. And so there is no end of life really, even though that's a phrase that's often used. But in addition to that, there is a significant climate change issue associated with the production of plastics. You'll see a little bit about how there are unjust methods of quote unquote managing plastic waste. There are a lot of emerging human health concerns. Folks might have seen a lot of that in the media. There's a lot of medical study right now showing the impacts of plastics on us humans. And there's been a lot of misdirection in terms of messaging and public relations on the part of industry directed towards us, the general public, the consumer. So how did we get here? This is a big spread in Life magazine in the mid-1950s celebrating throwaway living. So for the sake of convenience, folks were told to basically buy these products, use them, and throw them away. There are many, many ads like this one. You know, you might remember them, you might have seen them somewhere else, but essentially, you know, having households engage in more convenience and therefore having more time to do things they wanted besides washing dishes, right? It seems somewhat reasonable. So the problem is, though, is that as a substance, as a material, it is not designed to be biodegradable. So there is no end of life. And then a lot of it is designed to be disposable. So if you've got something that doesn't ever break down and it's disposable, you know, the logical end to that is that we're going to have an enormous waste problem. And that is where we're at today. So if, like myself, you in the last 10 to 15 to 20 years have looked around and thought, gosh, I really feel like there's a lot more plastic than there once was. You know, drinks were in bottles, right? Glass bottles, and then cans were very prolific and common. And then now like everything's in plastic. And for a while, I thought that that was possibly my imagination, but it turns out it definitely wasn't. About half of all plastic that's ever been produced has been produced since the year 2005. So there's been a major ramp up in plastic production and associated waste. So the graph that you see here is waste, and you can see primary waste generated in black. What's discarded is in red, incinerated, so burned, is in light green, and then recycled. You can see that that's very, very low, and we'll talk about that. And these are projections based not on, you know, just excessive doomsday thinking, but based on stated and advertised industry plans to ramp up plastic production further. So here's plastic waste by industry. And I got this slide from a Beyond Plastics colleague, and I thought that her comment here, she's the policy director at Beyond Plastics, I thought her comment was funny and very accurate. You know, what is plastic used for? The craziest thing in the world, packaging. A lot of it is used for just packaging. We use it once, we throw it away. You know, something like a plastic shopping bag is used for an average of 12 minutes total, and then it is almost never recycled. So you have that thing that we've used for 12 minutes total out there in the environment for, as far as we know, you know, hundreds, thousands of years. So she says totally absurd, and I have to agree. So where is all this going? You can see the input here, new plastics, residual. So plastics from stock that already, from feedstock that already exists. Little tiny recycling down here. Folks can see that recycled plastics going back into the usage sort of pipeline. And then you can see that a lot of them are incinerated, mismanaged, which we'll talk about a little bit. Ocean plastics. You know, so 8 million plus tons per year end up in the ocean, and then a lot of it, the vast majority of it, ends up in landfills. So estimates are starting to get higher as people observe the waste to ocean pipeline, if you will. And so we're looking at 8 to 15 million tons of plastics entering our oceans every year. This is clearly not sustainable. This is from the NOAA website on marine debris, and they have a lot of really good resources on the oceans and debris and how it gets there and the various research studies that are happening. I highly recommend it as a source. You can see that here are some of the commonly found plastics. And then this is sort of telling us about the ways that plastics reach the ocean and a little bit about what happens. So I want to sort of highlight right here, about 80% of plastics that end up in the ocean they come from land in the first place. So that does not include things like fishing nets that are left out there. It does not include like illegal marine dumping. A lot of it is simply debris that's carried off of land and into a nearby water body. There is intentional littering still. It's not as bad as, you know, I remember from being a kid, but it still does occur. And then we have streams and storm drains, and I'll give you a few examples of how exactly that happens. So, you know, in some cases it's intentional. There is illegal dumping, there is intentional littering, but a lot of this is not intentional. And it's a matter of either mismanagement or just essentially a mistake. But all of that ends up to 8 to 15 million tons a year of plastic into our oceans. So I'm sure folks know this, but I don't know how much one would think about it. I didn't really think about it that much until I started, really considering how so much plastic ends up in our oceans. So of course, in our households and businesses, we have household sewage that goes to a treatment plant, right? And unfortunately, there's a lot of microplastic that is not captured in our sewage treatment plants. However, a lot of the bigger pieces are. But an additional problem is that, of course, our storm drains, when it rains and water comes off the land, and we need to divert it from things like roads, it does not get treated, of course, and it goes down a storm drain channel. So we've all seen things like this, right? Of course, perhaps often. And where's this trash going to go? I mean, if no one literally picks it up and puts it in and makes sure the lid is closed, this is going to blow around, and it's really eventually going to end up either trapped in some vegetation somewhere, or eventually more likely into some kind of storm drain or directly into a waterway. So this is a picture. I was thinking about this presentation, and this is near a local strip mall. And I happened to see they were mowing and debris was flying everywhere. And I thought, hey, this is exactly the sort of debris that is almost certainly going to end up in a waterway through some channel. So you can see, our storm drains will catch some things, but not others. Some of these bigger pieces may not end up there. They might be picked up. They might roll further away and get into a creek that does not have a grate upon it. This is a picture from a stormwater management contractor, I believe in California, and they were examining a drain pipe, and this is what they found in it. So you can imagine eventually that sort of debris is going to come out of our water management system and end up in bodies of water. And this is a picture up in Minnesota and of a big drain pipe emptying into the Mississippi River. So even though I'm sitting right here in central Missouri and I'm not really near an ocean, a lot of the things that we see here in Missouri, of course, are eventually going to end up in the ocean. So here's the Missouri River course, and here's the little Mississippi that is not but a tributary of the mighty Missouri, of course. So I wanted to tell you folks about something that we did in relation to plastic last fall. Our friends at Missouri River Relief, which is a wonderful local organization that does river cleanups and an enormous amount of environmental education, we tacked what is known as a plastic brand audit onto one of their big river cleanups. And Missouri River Relief spent many days out on the river during this event that they called the Big Muddy Clean Sweep. That Big Muddy is the nickname of the Missouri River. And so we just did an audit, a plastic brand audit for one day on, we didn't even get to all of the trash that River Relief pulled out of the Missouri River on that day. And this is what just part of it looked like. This is probably maybe 3/4 of it from that one day. And most of this was plastic waste that was floating around the river. And this is what the plastic brand audit looked like. We all, we got together with 10 or 12 folks, and we all volunteered to sift through this plastic trash that had come out, and the vast majority of it was in fact plastic. And we were looking to see which brands were the most prevalent in order to collect data for the Break Free from Plastic Global Brand Audit. So that's what that looked like. So if Missouri River Relief had not pulled all of this out of the river, which they do on a very regular basis, and they never run out of trash to pull out of the river, it would have ultimately ended up in the Gulf of Mexico, of course. So something that folks like to talk about a lot is that the highest prevalence of plastic waste that ends up in the ocean come from these rivers in Africa, India, and Asia. So These rivers carry about 90% of the plastic waste. So you can imagine, given what you just saw about the Missouri River in one day, this is going to be a lot of plastic trash. And, you know, sometimes the narrative is that, well, look, we're not doing so bad, right? In the United States, look at all, you know, 90% of the trash is coming from these countries that are clearly, you know, the problem. We're not. But a lot of the waste, not all of it, but we export a lot of our waste, as do other developed countries, to countries that don't have the waste management infrastructure to handle it. And then our trash ends up in the rivers and the oceans as well. So this is a 2020 chart of the top plastic exporters and the top plastic importers at that time. So some places have better catchments and better management infrastructure to handle these things, but in many cases, they don't. You can see here in 2021, and this is now in pounds instead of tons, but you can see we ship a lot of waste to Canada, but it is then re-exported. And you can see some of the other top countries to which we export our waste: Malaysia, India, Vietnam, Indonesia. So this is what that ends up looking like on the ground to these countries that get our waste as well as their own, and as well as quite a lot from other developed nations, and don't have the infrastructure to handle it. So this is in Vietnam, and this is in the Philippines. And you can imagine that some amount of that is going to end up directly in waterways and directly into the ocean. And this is Indonesia here. So what happens then, other than being incredibly unsightly and potentially dangerous to wildlife, what happens to plastics in the ocean, or in waterways in general, but it is even more extreme in the ocean? The sun and wave action will take these materials and essentially break them down. Not all the way, but they end up eventually turning into something that we call microplastics. And where is this happening? This is another NOAA marine debris poster. Folks have heard of the garbage patches, of course, the large garbage patches. My understanding from speaking with or hearing from a bunch of researchers that work on ocean plastics is that, yes, you can see some of this, but a lot of it is actually more in a gyre underwater, and a lot of it is very, very small, because of how the wind and wave action will break down our plastics, not entirely, but into smaller and smaller pieces. So when we say microplastics, this is the typical definition, less than 5 millimeters, and they're almost always derived from larger plastic objects degrading into the environment. And so you can see, you know, these are very small. If you're a small fish, you probably think that that's food, right? So more and more information is emerging on microplastics. This is a photo of a microfiber, a plastic microfiber, embedded in a snowflake. So this is just how small that we've measured at this time. They are carried on air currents as well as water when they get small enough, which is why you're starting to hear more and more about plastics being found at high remote alpine peaks that are uninhabited, or in Arctic ice, or, you know, some of these remote places where not even the actual debris is reaching, but these smaller plastics are reaching all over the world. So problematically, when they get this small, we can easily ingest them, as well as, you know, certainly the ocean organisms and land organisms ingesting them as well. We end up doing so also. And so medical research is now showing that we're ingesting quite a bit. It has been found recently in human blood. You can see that this article is from March of 2022, so some emerging research there. It has been found in the human placenta. Here are some typical ways that we are ingesting either eating, drinking, or breathing microplastics. And you can see it makes sense, right? Bottled water is going to be a big driver of this, but there are other things that we eat and drink as well. So beer honestly surprised me. Air, tap water, and then here's seafood, and going on further. So this is obviously like an incredibly pervasive problem, especially if it has to do with bottled water. These are the purchases of bottled water, packaged in plastic, and and how much that market share has grown just since 1996, and this ends in 2010. So you can see we are consuming more and more and more and more bottled water, and that may not turn out to be a very good thing for us. So how and why is this not good? You know, kind of what does this matter? And what health effects are being found, or should we maybe expect? So one of the major concerns is that plastics, and I'll in just a second talk about why this is, but they're associated with endocrine disrupting chemicals. And disrupting the human endocrine system is not good. You can see some of the various negative effects that it can have when we ingest EDCs, endocrine disrupting chemicals. And the reason for this and how we're exposed via plastic is because of this. So plastics are made from chemicals married molecularly to fossil fuels. Fossil fuels, of course, are coal, oil, and gas. The very first plastic ever invented in, I believe, 1905 or 1909, was made of formaldehyde and coal oil. And it's called Bakelite, and you'll sometimes see even now Bakelite products that are on eBay or in antique stores or thrift stores or whatever. So formaldehyde and coal oil was the first substance, but pretty much all plastics are made from some sort of chemical constituency of fossil fuels and chemicals. So some of these chemicals include things like flame retardants, because if you're making something out of a fossil fuel, you probably don't want it to, you know, combust or light it on fire by mistake. Phthalates, bisphenols, which is BPA. A lot of folks have heard of BPA, and some things are BPA free now and are that is replaced by a different BPA. Methyl mercury, various fluorinated compounds. And if incinerated, because of their chemical constituency, molecular constituency, plastics will release things like dioxins and cadmium and vinyl chloride. So stuff that we don't want to be breathing. At this point, and this is really important for why we're seeing so much proliferation, especially in single-use plastics, is that we are making more and more plastics from ethane. Ethane is a byproduct of hydrofracking, also known as fracking, commonly known as fracking. And so we're aware of the fracking boom that has occurred and resulted in lots and lots of natural gas, right? And the byproduct of that is ethane. So we have this very, very abundant and very, very inexpensive building block for plastics. So as we, globally are starting to move slowly away from fossil fuels as a, energy source and transportation source, the industry wants to continue, using fossil fuels and making lots and lots of profits off of them. And the main way that they're proposing to do that is by increasing plastic production. So this animation here is from the movie The Story of Plastic, which is a really excellent explanation of particularly the production end of things. And so at this point, I believe, since the movie was made, there's a few more. It's over 330 newer expanded facilities that will produce plastic with the building block of ethane. These are called cracker plants. They're called that because they crack the ethane molecule into ethylene. So that can be used as a plastic feedstock. So this is This is a report that came out from the American Chemistry Council in 2015. And it essentially just says, hey, we have got so much fracked gas and there's so much fracking going on, and we have all of this byproduct of ethane. This is great. We can make a lot of plastic now, and it's a competitive advantage. And so when there are forecasts of increased plastic production, again, it's not that we're just afraid of that happening. It's the industry's proposed plan. And just so you know, this is what a ethane cracker plant looks like. So a problem that results from this is not only that we end up with a lot more plastic and therefore a lot more plastic pollution that doesn't biodegrade, it is also a very, very greenhouse gas rich production process. So essentially from extraction all the way to when these materials are entering our environment, it's not good for anyone. I want to get my stats here. So the over 300 new plants that have been proposed, about 50 of them are actually in permitting right now with the EPA, which allows these, and that means that those are funded already. And so there's a very good chance that they will actually come into operation. There is a Shell cracker plant on the banks of the Ohio River right now in Beaver County, Pennsylvania, that is right about to come online, that is permitted to emit as much as a couple coal plants, which we're always talking about retiring coal plants, right? So if these 300, which not all have funding and they're not all in permitting, so hopefully they won't actually be built and get into operation. But if those are all approved and go online, they will produce greenhouse gas emissions equal to about 290 coal-fired power plants. And in 2019, we had 241 coal-fired power plants operating in the United States. So it would essentially double greenhouse gas emissions in terms of coal. So Beyond Plastics has a bunch of good reports. I definitely recommend checking out our organization's website. But one of those is a recent report about exactly how this is happening, the exact amount of greenhouse gas emissions that would occur, and where things are in terms of the funding and permitting processes for these. So the placement of these and their emissions are not shared equally. So you can see that down here on the Texas and Louisiana coast and a little bit in the interior is a concentration for facilities like this. If folks know about Cancer Alley, a very infamous stretch of Louisiana from about Baton Rouge to about New Orleans, cancer rates are very, very, very high. And a lot of different fossil fuel plants, refineries, existing ethane crackers, et cetera, are located there. Another thing, and this is again related to the Gulf Coast complex, is these things that are, I know it's a nice name, it's called nurdles. That sounds pretty innocent, right? These are some of the feedstock that go into plastic products, and these are manufactured in enormous quantities, tons and tons, in many places, but very specifically in the Gulf Coast area. The person that you see down here, her name is Diane Wilson, and she started something called the Nurdle Patrol to try and really get a handle on how much of this is actually just entering the Gulf of Mexico. And her group of volunteers found, they collected so much data that they were actually successful in bringing a lawsuit against Formosa Plastics, which was the main emitter of these nurdles into the Gulf. And so you can see that that was a pretty big win. It certainly didn't stop the production of these feedstocks or really any increased expansion, but it was still a win, and Formosa is supposed to not be losing nurdles into the Gulf anymore. So briefly, another nurdle story, because these are small plastics that end up in our oceans. If folks remember last May of 2021, a ship sank off the coast of Sri Lanka called the Express Pearl, I believe, and it was out of Singapore, and it was carrying a lot of things and lit on fire and had chemicals, and people were like, this is an environmental disaster. Well, it definitely was for those reasons, but it was also carrying hundreds of thousands of tons of nurdles. And this is, here it is actually burning off the coast of Sri Lanka. This is what their beach looked like at that point. And folks were finding things like this, fish that were dying from eating enormous amounts of these plastic material building blocks from this cargo ship. So what are some solutions? What are we going to do about this? Because we clearly can't keep dumping enormous amounts of plastics into our waterways, into our oceans. So some folks might remember this, or have seen it. It was certainly very, very famous. It is a campaign to stop littering, which is really good. We don't need to be littering. But it is considered as one of the first really pervasive examples of greenwashing by industry onto consumers. So basically, it just said, if you're a good and decent person and don't litter, we won't have any of this pollution. So even as littering has dropped enormously due to both regulation and social pressure, right? It's not acceptable to just be throwing things out your car window. It hasn't stopped our pollution at all. The much more recent, that was in the 1970s, the much more recent example of this is something that was launched in late 2018, early 2019, the Alliance to End Plastic Waste. And this is an industry coalition of companies such as ExxonMobil and Dow and ConocoPhillips Chemical and Formosa Plastics of Texas coast fame. And they said, this is not acceptable, and we're gonna, as an industry coalition, we're gonna support ending plastic waste. Cool, sounds really good. So they announced that they were going to invest $1.5 billion in cleanup projects, and I don't just mean beach cleanups and river cleanups are an example of that, but also attempts at innovation to pull existing plastics out of the ocean and things of that nature. So the thing is that at the same time that they announced this, they had already invested this in ramping up plastic production since 2010, and this number is even higher now. And so we don't have the capacity to deal with this much plastic. It doesn't matter how many wonderful Missouri River reliefs there are out there trying to clean up our rivers and our streams on the way to the ocean. So one thing I want to point out, and this is the folks at the American Chemistry Council again that have that report about the competitive advantage of US plastics, this is on their website right now. Plastics help us protect the environment by reducing waste, lowering greenhouse gas emissions, and saving energy at home, work, and on the road. Plastic packaging helps to dramatically extend the shelf life of fresh foods. Some truth to that, right? While allowing us to ship more product with less packaging material. I don't know, having just come out of the pandemic and mail ordered quite a lot of stuff, I don't know that I'm seeing a reduction in packaging material for mailing. So the data that are out there from all manner of sources globally show this to be false. We are not protecting the environment. We are not reducing waste. We are not lowering greenhouse gas emissions. And plastic packaging has proliferated out of control. So we are often told that recycling is the answer. And please, folks, do not think that I recycle. I am not advocating that you don't recycle materials into blue bins or take your recycling to your local facility. etc. We certainly do that in my household. But the recycling rates, the actual rates of plastic that is recycled, are much, much, much lower than I ever thought. We're sort of led to believe, like, if we can just use all this plastic packaging, and as long as we recycle our single-use plastics, that's totally going to be okay. It turns out that's really not so. Of all of that plastic, the millions, billions now, tons of plastic that has ever been produced, less than 9% has been recycled. And there's some very recent data by Beyond Plastics and a number of partner organizations that show that more recently it's more like 5 or 6%. So this is really not happening. You saw that graphic at the beginning where the majority of it is still landfilled, which is better than it ending up in the ocean, but nonetheless. So if things are technically recyclable, maybe, right? There is, particularly with numbers 1 and 2 that we know as consumers, they are technically recyclable. But if the infrastructure isn't there, whether that is, in some of the developing nations that are taking our waste as well as their own, or even just in our local communities. I mean, I know here in Central Missouri, 1 and 2, they attempt to recycle most of it. Those are the only ones that our local facility takes. And the market for 1 and 2 isn't that great either. And that's essentially because it's cheaper to make new plastic because we have such a boom of ethane and chemicals than it is to recycle it. So we need to remember that all of these things that we are told that it's our fault as consumers for using too much or not recycling enough, we are talking about, this is their product. They want to make it and they want to sell it, and they want to sell as much as possible. It's, pretty simple. So this is something to remember. I thought that this was a pretty funny meme. Bottled water companies don't actually produce water. What they produce is plastic bottles that they put regular water in. So, 8 to 15 million tons of plastic entering the ocean every year looks like about a dump truck's worth every single minute. And we've been told recycling is going to be the thing that saves us from plastic pollution for decades, certainly for my whole lifetime. And this wouldn't be happening if recycling was working. So there's a lot of different false solutions to be aware of. You can see some of them here. I'm not going to, each of these is like its own separate talk about why they don't work to expectations, or why they might produce emissions or even products that are more toxic even than the original plastic, etc. But what we really need to do, if we really want to stop plastic pollution, including the proliferation of these materials in our oceans and in our environment, and the as well as the emissions and the chemicals that are used throughout the lifeline of plastic, we need to stop making single-use plastics. So there's a lot of people across the world that are very interested in this topic and that want this to happen. So there's various pieces of legislation. This is an example from our own United States Congress. Just one of the things that are in it is it would put a pause on plastic production facilities for 3 years. So those cracker plants, et cetera, that I was speaking about would be really reviewed, and from start to finish, from production to what it might mean if they were put online for our plastic pollution problem. So that's just one aspect of one bill. There are international hazardous waste treaties that now include plastic that are being negotiated right now, largely in an attempt to stop this waste export problem to countries that don't have the infrastructure to handle additional waste. So those are things that we as individuals can support, particularly at the local level. And I'll just give you an example of that in a second. And then there's a lot of corporate advocacy. So essentially we're saying to companies, please stop making single-use packaging. There are a lot of actions. This is Plastic Free July. That has been, named as a month where we can all kind of get together and take action. But I would definitely, of course, advocate for plastic free as much as possible every month. And then community science as well. So that brand audit that I told you about towards the beginning is an example of community science. And those are really important, and I will tell you why. So a piece of legislation that passed in the US Congress 2020, was the Save Our Seas 2.0 Act. And one of the things that the Save Our Seas Act did was to delegate to the National Academies of Science an examination of how much the US actually contributes to ocean plastic pollution. So they collected an enormous amount of data. The report is out there. This particular screenshot is from a webinar that the folks at the National Academies gave showing their findings. So what I wanted to point out to you here is, even they concluded, based on all of the data that they examined, is that we really need to reduce production. And we need to innovate design and materials so that there's less packaging needed, and therefore just less plastic in circulation to begin with. And then you can see, sort of the step down of, from largest to smallest, most important to not as urgent steps. So these are things that we can all do. And I know everybody says this, I get that. Everyone says reduce, reuse, refill, but it is really important. And the more and more people that do it, which there are a lot of folks now, the less there is demand for these single-use products. So empowering yourself with information. I'm going to show you a list of resources and tell you about a couple other opportunities. There is a lot of action in this particular topic right now, and a lot of opportunities for learning and for talking to others. So community science data, joining or starting something like, it doesn't have to be a plastic brand audit, or doesn't have to be a nerdle patrol. Sometimes it seems like we're all individually trying so hard, but that, it's very overwhelming and we don't feel that we can do a lot as individuals. Well, once again, at that same National Academies of Science webinar, they discussed how they're incorporating citizen science data into their framework, and how you can see here the community-based data for marine debris tracking was incorporated into a National Academies of Science report. So it is really important and very good for, it's a good action for really contributing to the solutions to this problem. Lots of things one can do locally. I know that in New York and other states, of course, there has been a lot of movement, both at the local and state level, on things like plastic bag bans or styrofoam bans or plastic straw bans, things like that, or other disincentive strategies. So with our state and federal level legislation, we can always call and write our reps. If enough people do this, they will take notice and potentially be willing to co-sponsor things like the Break Free from Plastic Pollution Act. Corporate, so there is really a ton of movement on the corporate advocacy level at this point. Many people and individuals and organizations are using social media, particularly to just constantly and continually call out these various corporations who, continue to say it's our responsibility as consumers, it's, municipalities' responsibility to deal with their own waste problem. And meanwhile, they're doing things like switching from cans to plastic bottles. So just wanted to point out briefly that this plastic trifecta, right? So these are large volumes of what ends up being plastic pollution. They're, except in very rare cases, not necessary, and they're easily replaceable items. And so Beyond Plastic calls this the plastic trifecta. This is probably the easiest type of ban or disincentive structure to be passed locally, and literally hundreds of municipalities across the country have done this, as well as many countries throughout the world. There is sample legislation on the Beyond Plastics website where it's just a template that you can take it and customize it for your, county, municipality, etc. A note here, I'm sitting here in the state of Missouri right here, and you can see what that orange means is that we have a state preemption. And what that means is that no municipality in the state of Missouri is allowed to pass any kind of plastic bag ban. Our state legislature has said that municipalities are not allowed to take that local control step for their own. But you can see the various shades of blue, light blue and dark blue are the states that have successful locally adopted bag laws or even statewide bag laws, whether that again is straight up bans or disincentives of some kind. So, throughout the country, we sort of have this patchwork of challenges and or opportunities depending on where anyone is. That's about it for me. I just wanted to make you aware of a resource list that I've been compiling for about a year or so. It's up on our website. There's the tiny link, and I'm going to put this all in the chat as well, and then a QR code for folks that are good at using those. But there's so many resources out there at this point. And even some of these are like links that point to even larger resource lists. But these are some reports and articles and films and things like that that have been very helpful to me in understanding the depth and breadth of this issue. So hopefully, if we all work together and understand the issue and work on it and advocate for a cleaner, less plastic polluted planet, we won't have things that look like this. We'll have things that look like this, which I think as far as our oceans are concerned, we all want a clean and beautiful environment. So again, thank you, Irene, for
Thank you, Dana. Thank you very much. That was an excellent presentation. Thank you for taking my somewhat unrefined topic and turning it into something very comprehensible and just
I appreciate that. I know it's not, some of it's upsetting, information, but there's a lot of momentum for change right now. And I think that everyone, doing anything they can, there's nothing too small, and we don't need to get overwhelmed because there's a lot of folks working on this.
Yeah, I mean, it does seem that we aren't slowing down on plastic protection, though. It sounds like, yeah.
So far, that's true, but there was an enormous amount of pushback, and then, as I kind of alluded to at the beginning, the pandemic occurred, and at first, right, 2020, we didn't really know how the coronavirus was spread. We didn't know what materials it lingered on, right? Unfortunately, the plastic producing industry did take that and say, well, like, absolutely no more refillable bottles or, reusable this or reusable that. We all need to go. As it turned out, actually, what was it, maybe 6 months into the pandemic? It wasn't that long, 6-8 months. A scientific paper came out showing that COVID particles actually lasted longer on plastic than most surfaces, like more than wood, more than like other composites. So it wasn't so, but I think the momentum has returned, really.
Okay. Yeah, well, that was very good, very informative, really great, comprehensive. Thank you.